Yes, we are good.
Right, thank you, and thank you, Florian, and good morning, everyone. So welcome back to day 2 of Spinoza and Negativity, and I hope everyone is well rested this morning. So in our second session, we will have 3 speakers, Daniel Bella, Sibren Bieger, and Matteo Camerini, who will each speak for 30 minutes, followed by 30 minutes of discussion. So allow me to introduce our first speaker, Daniel Bella, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Hamburg. His project intends to contribute to the question of how necessitarianism, the view that nothing can be otherwise, and potencies, which are often believed to require some sort of possibility, are compatible within Spinoza's philosophy. Besides engaging with early modern philosophy, Daniel Bella is also interested in medieval and contemporary metaphysical discussions. At the moment, he is preparing a German translation of a short medieval treatise on the necessity and contingency of causes. Together with Milan Sturmer, he has also been publishing several articles about the process metaphysics of Alfred Whitehead. So Daniel will be speaking about his new interpretation of Spinoza's tool analogy in the treatise of the emendation of the intellect, and the title of his talk is Negativity in the Making, Rereading Spinoza's Tool Analogy. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian. Yeah, good morning. I'm very pleased to be here, and first of all, I want to thank the organizers for setting up this amazing event. So Professor Breuer, Florian, Siebrand, Sojourn, Ian, and the whole team, thanks. I think this is really an amazing opportunity. At the beginning of my talk, I would like to take up on 2 methodological insights which I learned during yesterday's talks and discussions. The first one starts from considering the simple historical fact that it is impossible to find the very notion of negativity in Spinoza's work. This means that we cannot directly assess negativity as such, but we need some kind of path to negativity. Second, there is not one, but there are many different paths to negativity. One reason for why I really like the idea of this conference is that it allows us to explore different versions of negativity. In my talk, I will try to develop one possible path, which I will tentatively call negativity of beginning, as I hope to show the concept of negativity of beginning wasn't only present at Spinoza's time, but was also developed and deployed by Spinoza himself. For substantiating this claim, I will go back to Spinoza's presumably first work, his unfinished Tractatus de Intellectus Emendatione. So my talk will directly take up on yesterday's contribution, on your contribution, Anne, basically, where you gave us a profound interpretation of the preface to the TE, and I now probably go a little bit further in the text. In short, my aim is to show that Spinoza's understanding of the method for producing true ideas entails some kind of negativity of beginning. So let's get started. What might negativity of beginning mean? A traditional path to the concept of beginning interprets it as a kind of arche or principle. While this can mean many things, I think one core assumption of this approach is that the beginning has a kind of foundational character to it. This means that the beginning grounds anything which succeeds it. So if we ask, for instance, why something exists, we will answer the question by going back to a first principle in virtue of which everything else exists. Now, the relation between this first principle and the things that it explains is often considered to be an asymmetrical one. Whereas anything else depends on the first principle itself is independent of the things it gives rise to. One classical example for such a first principle can be found in anniscient atomism. Roughly put, everything that exists is composed of and existentially dependent on indivisible and unchangeable parts. In his De Rerum Natura, Lucretius aptly calls this first principle, which explains the existence of everything else, primoria rerum, literally beginnings of things. As Lucretius argues, the stipulation of such a first principle has an important advantage. It explains our experience of an ordered universe. One way we make this experience is by the simple fact that the production of things requires some sort of work. Since nothing happens spontaneously, all things must be disposed and composed in a certain way to gain a certain result. So here's one lovely passage from Pierre Macherey. Lastly, inasmuch as we see that tilled grounds are better than the untilled, and when worked by hands yield better produce, we must know that there are in the earth first beginnings of things, which we call forth to birth by turning the teeming sods with the block-shar and drilling the soil of earth. But if there were none such, you would see all things without toil of powers, nostro sine quaeque labore, of their own sponta sua, will come to be far better. As much work as it is able to do, the assumption that there is something like a first principle grounding everything else has been confronted with an easy but effective skeptical objection. If it's true, the skeptic argues, that everything stems from a first principle, what about the first principle itself? Are we ready to accept that all our explanations are grounded in a first principle which cannot be explained itself? As you know, the history of philosophy offers a wide range of possible answers to this objection. What I call negativity of beginning denotes one such answer. The general idea behind negativity of beginning is that we can reduce the pressure on the first principle if we challenge foundationalism. This means that the first principle does not remain present during the whole process, but becomes less and less important. One way to flesh this out is to consider the first principle as a means or tool for bringing something about. Note that this might shift the relation between the first principle and the things it gives rise to. Whereas, according to the foundationalist view, everything else is asymmetrically existential dependent on the first principle. The first principle now becomes dependent on the things it produces because its raison d'être is to produce something else. So let's summarize the path to negativity which I'm suggesting here. The beginning is something which becomes diminished and even replaced during the process is initiated. This is a negative conception of the beginning, as the beginning is more and more present by its absence. So, having characterized one possible path to negativity, the next step is now to examine if some version of it was present at Spinoza's time. The reason for doing this little detour is that it allows us to better understand Spinoza's own possible contribution to this concept. In the following, I will focus on one occurrence of the concept of negativity of beginning contained in the work of Johannes Glauberg. Glauberg is one of those 17th century thinkers who became more and more attracted by Descartes' thought in the course of his career. In fact, he is considered to be the first to introduce Cartesianism to a German audience. That Spinoza was acquainted with at least some part of Glauberg's work is documented by the inventory of his library, which lists Glauberg's Logica. The passage I'm interested in stems from other of Glauberg's work, bearing the title Metaphysica de ente qui rectius onto Sophia. This work is most famous for being one of the first sources of the term ontology. I will cite the edition containing the opera Omnia from 1691. For Glauberg, a principle explains the production or existence of something. Roughly put, his description of the principle equals what I have called foundationalist view. But curiously, Glauberg also hints to a non-foundationalist account of beginning. And you can, I hope, see this here. In a note, he suggests the following distinction between the Latin terms principium and initium. Initium denotes the negation of the being of the preceding thing. Negationem tu esse precedentis, not the principle. It denotes the beginning of a thing, principle only the source. If the sun had existed from eternity, light still would have been something dependent on the sun. However, initium and principle often have the same meaning. According to Glauberg, principium and initium are different because only the latter, but not the former, entails a kind of negativity. So initium explains the coming into being of something by the negation of the thing which precedes it. Principium, by contrast, explains a thing's existence in virtue of something on which it existentially depends. According to the classical example Clark is mentioning here, the existence of light requires the existence of the sun. If the sun ceases to exist, light will also cease to exist. So this is one of the classical examples for a principle. Luckily, Klauberg's Ontosophia also contains an example of the initium. He is writing in the same manner, Janus, from whom the month January, which is the beginning, initium of the year, derives its name, is fashioned with two faces, looking at either side of the 2 years, the year gone and the year to come. And I think this is a powerful example for what negativity of beginning might mean. Like the beginning of a new year requires that the old one cease to exist, initium describes cases where something comes into being because something else vanishes. So I think at this point we might tick our first box and say, at the time of Spinoza's writing, the concept of negativity of beginning was present in a way and could take the form of a distinction between initium and principium. Consequently, our next task will be to examine if there are some reflections of negativity of beginning in Spinoza's own work. And for doing so, I suggest to taking a closer look at the tool analogy contained in the Tractatus de Intellectus Imitationum. As you all know, and I think So Jun is going to say more about this on Friday, part of what Spinoza is doing in this text is to answer the question how we can acquire true knowledge. Put crudely, Spinoza says that it is possible to acquire true knowledge if you possess a procedure for producing true knowledge. The name Spinoza uses for this procedure is methodus, or via, way. Unfortunately, there is an effective argument against any attempt to acquire true knowledge by deploying a certain method. And Spinoza states this argument in the following way. To do this, the first thing we must consider is that there is no infinite regress here. That is, to find the best method of seeking the truth, there's no need of another method to seek the method of seeking the truth, or a third method to seek the second, and so on to infinity. As an aside, the difference between the Latin text and Curly's translation is due to the fact that Menini, the editor of the Latin text, suggests to expurgate the two non, which he indicates by using this curly brackets. According to the skeptical argument, as soon as you agree that we can acquire true knowledge by deploying a method, we end up with an infinite regress. The reason for this is that a method for gaining true knowledge is not a neutral device, but can be true or false in an evaluative sense. We can get a grasp of this evaluative sense if we think of the statement that someone is a true friend. Does not mean that a person embodies the idea of friendship in the best sense of the word. Correspondingly, Spinoza does not search any method whatsoever, but the one which is most effective in showing us how to produce true ideas. But how can we evaluate if a method is a true method? According to the skeptic, defenders of methods had only one possible tool at hand for solving this problem, applying another method. Spinoza tries to rebuke the skeptical arguments against the method by showing that it has consequences which are incompatible with our practices. Spinoza's first step is to widen the scope of the argument, stating that if true, it must equally hold for bodily tools, instrumentor corporea. Spinoza's second step is to give an example of such a bodily tool, a hammer, which besides other things is needed to forge iron. Now, the instruments required for forging iron require other instruments in order to be produced. Again, the point of the argument is that once accepted that one needs instruments for producing something, the only explanation available for answering the follow-up question, how these instruments are produced in the first place, comes down to this. All instruments exist in virtue of the existence of other instruments. And here we have our regress. Spinoza chooses the traditional example of forging iron because it is obvious that human beings in fact possess the power to forge iron. Consequently, something must be wrong with an argument stating that human beings do not possess the power of forge iron. For defenders of a foundationalist account, the problem might be obvious. The skeptic simply gets the order wrong. In fact, you have to begin the story with something which is not a tool at all and grounds the existence of all tools. In other words, all we need is a principle from which we can derive the existence of tools, or so the foundationalist argues. One example for such a principle might be the intention of an artisan to forge iron. In short, the explanation of the foundationalist might run as follows. If someone has the intention to forge iron, she will search for convenient instruments and successively replace them by better tools. A version of this story can be found in Descartes' Regula ad directionem ingeniae, a work Spinoza might have been acquainted with when writing the TEE. So, it's the wrong direction, yeah. No.
You have the website.
So, thus, if here it reads man, but if someone, aliquis, wish to practice any of them, example given the craft of a smith, and were destitute of all instruments, he or she would be forced to use at first a hard stone or a rough lump of iron as an anvil, take a piece of rock in place of a hammer, make pieces of wood serve as tongs, and provide himself or herself with other such tools as necessity requires. Thus equipped, he or she would not then at once attempt to forge swords or helmets or any manufactured article of iron for others to use. He or she would first of all fashion hammer, anvil, tongs, and the other tools useful for herself. Descartes' description has a negative element to it. The tools which are used in the beginning, Descartes uses the term initio here, are replaced by more efficient tools during the process. The existence of the more elaborate tools thus requires that the initial tools become obsolete. They have simply done their work. Even though the initial tools vanish, there is something which grounds the process. It is the intention of the artisan to forge iron which explains the existence of the tools in the first place. This intention is not a tool itself, but a kind of theological principle grounding or guiding the whole process. Spinoza uses the same example, but with a twist, as he develops a negative, non-foundational account of its beginning. So Spinoza writes, and I'm going to read the second part of the comparison later, but just as human beings at the beginning were able to make some easiest things with innate tools, however laboriously and imperfectly, and once this had been made other more difficult things with less labor and more perfectly, and so proceeding gradually from the simplest works to tools, and from tools to other works and tools, reached a point where they accomplished so many and so difficult things with little labor. So what first might catch our attention here is that Spinoza describes this process without referring to any kind of intentional vocabulary. And I think this is really in line with what you, Anne, showed us yesterday regarding the term decision or deliberation. Whereas Descartes uses a volitive verb, Spinoza deploys the verb queo, which expresses the possession of an ability to do something. What is more, Spinoza does not refer to a principle which grounds the existence of tools, but states that the beginning of the production of tools, Spinoza also uses initio here, has to be explained by a special kind of tools which he calls innate tools. At first glance, this strategy seems hardly apt to satisfy the skeptic. If the point of the skeptic is that no instrument whatsoever can play a foundational role, how might innate tools be of any help here? If we look back to the quote, we can see that the rising complexity of the tools is inversely proportional to the amount of labor necessary for producing them. So we have two chains, the chain of tools and works, facilima, difficilia, and the chain of labor, laboriose, minori labore, paro labore. In short, a diminishing amount of labor is able to produce more and more complex instruments, which in turn allow for further reducing the amount of labor necessary within the production process. Since labor designates the contribution of the innate tools, we can conclude that the importance of these innate tools becomes reduced during the process. In other words, the contribution of the innate tools is not a constant factor, but becomes more and more negated instead. Unlike the sun, which must remain the same to guarantee the existence of light, the innate tools can withdraw their contribution without their productions becoming diminished. In fact, it is even the rising complexity of the tools which makes the vanishing of the innate tools possible. I think this is an interesting point, as it shows, compared to Descartes, that Spinoza adds another layer to the tool analogy. Like Descartes, Spinoza holds that the tools become negated within the process. They do their work by producing their own replacement. But in addition, Spinoza thinks that this process has no real principle, as the innate tools driving the process become more and more diminished. At this point, we might ask ourselves what Spinoza's answer to the counter-argument of the skeptic might be. And I think one possible version of this could be stated along these lines. Yes, you got it. They are only tools. But note that there are two kinds of tools. There are tools which immediately perish after having produced another, more efficient tool. And there are tools which are accompanying the process and in that sense are innate to it. However, the contribution of these innate tools decreases as the tools they produce become more and more complicated and more efficient. You may grant me the existence of these innate instruments as the ontological costs are rather low. The reason for this is that they negate themselves in the process. In a way, they are a free lunch. They disappear with the problem they intend to solve. Spinoza introduces the tool analogy in order to motivate his claim that the method for producing true ideas is in fact possible. We might thus ask which consequences the proposed interpretation of the tool analogy has for Spinoza's epistemology. Immediately after the quoted passage, Spinoza draws the epistemological consequences in this way, stating, in the same way, the intellect, by its native force, makes intellectual tools for itself, by which it acquires other forces for other intellectual works, and from these works still other tools or the power of searching further, and so proceeds gradually until it reaches the pinnacle of wisdom. Spinoza's comparison is not straightforward, as you see. Instead of the innate tools, he now mentions a vis nativa, a natural force. But a little bit later in the text, Spinoza says that in the case of intellectual tools, a true idea serves as innate tool. So it is by working on a true idea that the natural force produces intellectual works and hence new intellectual instruments. I think it is safe to say that we are reaching here one of the most complicated parts of Spinoza's early epistemology. There are at least two reasons for this. First, one might fear that the fact that a true idea is needed for producing true ideas is grist for the skeptic's mill. Second, Spinoza gives not a single example for such a true idea which human beings possess as a starting point for deploying a method. Against this backdrop, it is not surprising that there are different suggestions what this initial true idea might be. Recent candidates are the idea of God, as proposed, for example, by L. Mason and others, and the idea of one's own essence, as suggested by John Morrison. Despite their differences, these interpretations have in common that they adhere to a kind of foundationalism about true ideas, as they hold that these innate true ideas warrant the truth of the ideas deduced from them. My interpretation points into another direction, I think. In fact, if we take seriously that the true idea works as an innate tool of the intellect, we have to assume that it diminishes during its deployment. This means that it becomes less important. The reason for this is that the intellect has produced more and more powerful ideas and hence acquires a more complete understanding of nature. Whereas in the beginning, one single true idea provides the guiding line for the distinction between true and false ideas, this true idea becomes one among many other true ideas in the course of intellect's development of new instruments, as Spinoza writes. Yes. Next, the more the mind knows, the better it understands its own forces and the order of nature. The better the mind understands its own forces, the more easily it can direct itself and propose rules to itself. The better it understands the order of nature, the more easily it can restrain itself from useless pursuits. In these things, as we have said, the whole of the method consists. Here Spinoza clearly states that the method itself becomes better by deploying it. The method itself has hence a kind of history. It is this historical character of the method which might help us to better understand the connection between individual improvements and social change, which Spinoza addresses right at the beginning of his TEE. There, Spinoza writes, "It is part of my happiness to take pains that many others may understand as I understand, so that their intellect and desire agree entirely convenient with my intellect and desire." To my mind, but this is something of course open for discussion later, the negative interpretation proposed here is better suited to grasp the social dimension of Spinoza's endeavor than a foundationalist one. As long as we assume that the truth of our knowledge is founded in a true idea which we possess right from the start, the social dimension of the process of emanating it is only an external one. Maybe people who are already far down the process might help others by deriving true consequences from their innate ideas. But ultimately, anyone produces true ideas on her or his own. However, if we assume that the individual starting point of anyone becomes diminished in the process, the agreement Spinoza is writing about can be described as a social product. The reason for this is that according to my non-foundationalist interpretation, people do not simply deduce their ideas of the whole from an innate idea, maybe, for instance, the idea of God. Instead, and I think this is connected, Sophie, to your point about the third meaning of deliberare. To produce more and more complete true ideas, we have to come together with others in order to develop them. What this amounts to is that Spinoza defends some kind of holism regarding the evaluative truth of an idea. Following an interpretation developed by Michael della Rocca and further proved by Martin Lenz, we could say that at least in the TEE, Spinoza believes that the truth of an idea hinges on the knowledge of other ideas. In order to have a true idea, this idea must be connected to many other true ideas. But the process of connecting ideas to other ideas entails at the same time that the true idea we began with becomes less and less important. Let me conclude here. The path of negativity which we pursued led us from an account of a first principle which explains the necessity of labor to a negative beginning, which holds that the amount of labor necessary for producing tools diminishes step by step. As we have seen, referring to the example of the initial god Janus, Glauberg neatly hinted at the ambivalent character of the negativity of beginning. Something ceases to exist and thereby gives rise to something else. Hence, the beginning of something requires, as Glauberg puts it, that the preceding thing is negated. To be sure, and I remind you only of this in order to maybe discuss about it later, this interpretation of negativity of beginning is not the only one possible. So my path to negativity beginning might even not be the most prominent within 20th century thought. And so I think, to be fair, I have to mention this in the end, that Hannah Arendt, who writes a lot about the distinction between principium and initium, really takes another path. Drawing on Augustine, Arendt maintains that the initium is an unprecedented beginning. This means that the initium negates the mere nothingness, and not, as I have, or Glauberg has it, a concrete being which precedes it. Consequently, we might arrive, following Arendt, at a more positive path to negativity of beginning. Accordingly, the beginning is only negative to the extent that it negates nothingness and thus gives rise, in a positive way, to beginning itself. However, giving rise to the beginning as such, the initium initiates the existence of the end as well. And this is my last quote from Hannah Arendt, from a part which was later added to her dissertation about, or her PhD about Augustine. Everything that has a beginning in the sense that a new story begins with it, initium and not principium, must also have an end, and therefore cannot truly be. This is just to remind you of an obvious point. If I had begun with Arendt's account of the beginning, we surely would have ended up somewhere else. At least insofar, the beginning remains decisive, despite all its negativity. Thank you for your attention.